The final notice, the morning I found my car covered in HOA violation notices. I thought it was just another petty warning. But when I saw the note taped to my door, bold, red letters spelling final notice of eviction, I knew something far darker was happening. The same board that promised community harmony had turned into a neighborhood regime, targeting anyone who dared to push back. What started as a simple argument over a lawn ornament spiraled into a full-blown campaign to destroy my life, one fine and rumor at a time. And the worst part? I was about to discover just how far they'd go to make me disappear from my own home. Karen's patrol, 4 years. Maple Hollow was everything I dreamed of. Quiet mornings, tidy lawns, and neighbors who waved as they walked their dogs. My husband and I had worked decades to afford this little slice of peace, tucked behind a line of oak trees at the edge of the valley. We thought we'd found our forever home, a place where our kids could grow up safe, where the world finally felt simple. At first, the homeowners association seemed harmless enough. Monthly newsletters, community barbecues, and polite reminders to maintain aesthetic harmony. The board was led by Karen, a woman who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She was always smiling, always watching, always just a little too involved. If you parked your car on the wrong side of the street, she noticed. If your shutters weren't the approved shade of beige, you'd get a note. She called it preserving property value. The rest of us called it exhausting. Still, I played along. I trimmed the hedges exactly to height, painted the mailbox the regulation color, and kept my lawn immaculate. It wasn't worth a fight, not over something so small. But I started noticing the way Karen's eyes lingered on my property. The way she'd slow her golf cart whenever she passed, clipboard in hand, jotting something down. Violation on the door. Then one afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange warning pinned to my garage door. Non-compliant modification. Unauthorized structure in view. The supposed structure was a small garden shed I'd built behind my house. Invisible from the road, permitted by the county, but apparently a violation of the HOA's ever-changing aesthetic standards. I remember standing there, that notice fluttering in the breeze, realizing this wasn't about rules. It was about control, about someone who needed to remind everyone exactly who ran Maple Hollow. And from that moment on, life in our peaceful neighborhood would never feel peaceful again. The HOA meeting the week after that first violation notice, I tried to brush it off. Told myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Karen had mistaken my shed for something else. Maybe if I called the HOA office and explained, they'd retract the warning. That hope didn't last long. The next morning, I woke to find 2 more notices taped to my mailbox. One for improper exterior paint hue, and another for unauthorized garden placement. I stared at the papers, stunned. The paint color? It was exactly the one from the HOA-approved palette. And my garden? A few potted tomatoes near the porch. But each notice came with a fine. $100 here, $250 there. And a warning that continued violations may result in legal action. It was almost laughable. Almost. Until I realized this wasn't random. It was targeted. At first, I tried to reason with them. I attended the next HOA meeting, sitting in a circle of folding chairs beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the community clubhouse. Karen sat at the center, wearing her trademark pastel blazer and pearl necklace, with a stack of papers and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I explained that my shed met county codes, that my paint color was approved, that none of the violations were legitimate. She listened, or at least pretended to. Then she said, in that sickly sweet tone she used for everything, "We just want what's best for the community. Maybe your interpretation of the rules is a little different than ours." The room chuckled. The board members, her hand-picked allies, nodded in agreement. I left that meeting with nothing but more warnings and a pit in my stomach. The harassment escalates. Within days, things got worse. My mailbox, the one I just repainted, was mysteriously dented overnight. My sprinklers were tampered with, flooding a patch of the yard. Even the garden shed had deep scratches across its side, as if someone had dragged metal along the panels. When I reported the vandalism, the HOA's response was to send me another violation for property damage. They fined me for the very thing I'd been victimized by. That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't about aesthetics, or property value, or community pride. This was personal. Karen didn't just want me to comply. She wanted me gone. Evidence and resolve. I started keeping records. Photos of every notice, every bit of damage, every conversation. I logged the dates and times of her patrols because, yes, she drove her golf cart past my house multiple times a day. Sometimes she'd stop, pretending to inspect a nearby bush, but I could feel her eyes on me. One afternoon, I heard the sound of her golf cart tires crunching up the gravel again. I stepped out onto the porch, phone in hand, recording. She froze for a second, then smiled and waved. "Just checking on the hedges," she said. The next day, I received a fine for aggressive behavior toward an HOA officer. That's when fear started mixing with anger. A few neighbors quietly warned me that I wasn't the first. Apparently, Karen had a habit of singling out homeowners who didn't fit her vision. A young couple who installed solar panels, forced to remove them under threat of daily fines. An elderly widow who painted her door sky blue, dragged into arbitration. Even the family across the street, who dared to build a small deck, were slapped with $10,000 in violation penalties. Most eventually gave up or moved out. It was a pattern, one that thrived on exhaustion and silence. But I wasn't going anywhere. I filed an appeal, citing the HOA's failure to follow due process. I even hired a lawyer, a calm, methodical man who'd handled dozens of HOA disputes. He warned me that these cases could get messy. HOAs are like small governments, he said. They think they're untouchable. He wasn't wrong. As soon as the board received my appeal, they retaliated. I started getting letters accusing me of unauthorized business activity. Apparently, the board had decided my small Etsy side hustle, run entirely from my laptop, counted as commercial use of residential property. Another fine, another threat of lien. Then came the final straw, a certified letter claiming I owed over $4,000 in accumulated penalties. If I didn't pay within 14 days, they'd take appropriate legal action to recover the debt. That was when I realized they were trying to bankrupt me out of my own home. But instead of backing down, I decided to fight back. The news expose with my lawyer's help, I filed a counter-complaint with the county's housing authority, attaching every shred of documentation I'd gathered. Dates, photos, videos, recordings, everything. And that's when things got really ugly. Someone started following me. At first, it was subtle. A white SUV parked near the corner whenever I left for work. Then it began showing up outside my driveway at night, lights off, engine idling. Once, I even caught Karen's husband behind the wheel. When I confronted her at the next HOA meeting, the mask slipped. "You think you can take us down?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You'll regret it." The room went dead silent. Even her loyal board members looked uneasy. Days later, I received an email from the HOA's legal counsel claiming I'd engaged in defamation and harassment. They demanded a public apology and the immediate removal of my complaint from the county office. But by then, it was too late. The housing authority had already opened an investigation. An inspector visited Maple Hollow quietly, speaking to residents and reviewing records. Word spread fast, and suddenly, the same neighbors who'd once avoided me started whispering their own stories. The pattern was clear: selective enforcement, intimidation, financial pressure. And for the first time, Karen wasn't the one in control. Then, one night, I came home to find my shed destroyed. The door ripped off its hinges. The roof caved in. My tools scattered in the grass. It looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. I called the police, shaking with anger. When they arrived, they confirmed it was deliberate vandalism. But when they asked if I had any idea who might have done it, I didn't even have to answer. The next morning, Karen drove by in her golf cart, her husband beside her, both wearing smug little smiles. And taped to what was left of my shed door was another violation notice. Unauthorized debris on property. That was the moment something in me broke, or maybe hardened. I realized I wasn't dealing with a neighbor anymore. I was dealing with a bully with power, the kind who hides behind policy and procedure. I decided I wasn't going to just survive this. I was going to end it. I contacted a local news outlet that covered housing and HOA abuse stories. Within a week, a journalist reached out. We met at a cafe outside the neighborhood, where I handed over everything. Every photo, every fine, every recorded interaction. She listened quietly, taking notes, her eyes widening with every page. "This isn't just harassment," she said finally. "This could be criminal." A few days later, the story aired. Homeowner targeted by HOA board. Retaliation or rule enforcement? The segment showed everything: the letters, the fines, the footage of Karen patrolling in her golf cart. They even interviewed a few brave neighbors who'd come forward. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Some people stopped to thank me. Others avoided eye contact. Karen didn't show up to the next meeting. But when she finally did appear weeks later, she wasn't smiling anymore. Her voice trembled as she read a prepared statement, denying all wrongdoing. But behind her, the county investigator sat silently, recording everything. And then came the bombshell. The county's report concluded that the HOA had violated multiple statutes, including misuse of funds, harassment, and failure to follow proper governance procedures. The board was suspended pending further review. Karen's golf cart, once her symbol of authority, was confiscated as part of the investigation. The power she'd clung to for years was gone overnight. But even as the community began to breathe again, I couldn't shake one thought. If I hadn't documented everything, if I hadn't stood my ground, I might have lost everything. My home, my peace, my dignity. And though the fight wasn't over yet, one thing had changed forever. Karen no longer ruled Maple Hollow, and I wasn't the one afraid anymore. The morning of the HOA hearing felt like the calm before a storm. That strange, heavy quiet that presses down before lightning splits the sky. I'd barely slept the night before. My kitchen table was buried under stacks of paperwork. Violation notices, bank statements, copies of the county report. Every fine, every false accusation, every photo of the damage they'd caused was lined up in chronological order. This was the day everything came to a head. The county investigator had ordered a formal hearing to decide whether Maple Hollow's HOA would be dissolved or placed under state control. Karen and her board were required to appear. So was I, the homeowner who had disrupted community harmony. When I pulled up to the community hall, Karen's golf cart was already parked out front, gleaming like a badge of office. Her husband leaned against it, arms crossed, smirking. The board members stood in a tight cluster by the entrance, whispering nervously. But when they saw me, the whispers stopped. I walked straight past them. I wasn't here to plead. I was here to finish this. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Rows of neighbors filled the folding chairs, some there out of curiosity, others out of quiet support. For months, people had been afraid to speak up, but after the news story aired, something in them had shifted. They wanted to see what would happen next. At the front sat the county's oversight committee. 3 officials, neutral and cold-faced, surrounded by stacks of documents and evidence binders. The middle chair, occupied by a stern woman in a gray suit, belonged to the lead investigator. She looked up as I entered, nodded once, and motioned for everyone to take their seats. Karen sat across the room, her pastel blazer replaced with a more formal navy one. But she couldn't hide the twitch in her jaw or the tremor in her hand as she adjusted her papers. The hearing began with formalities, statements, rule citations, procedural recaps. But beneath the bureaucratic language, you could feel the tension building, like a fuse slowly burning toward the dynamite. When it was my turn to speak, my palms were slick with sweat. I stood, faced the committee, and began. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. I said, my voice steady. A notice here, a fine there. But what started as small, selective enforcement turned into a campaign of harassment. Over 10 months, I've received 37 separate violations, the majority of which were proven false. My property was vandalized, my privacy invaded, and I was threatened with foreclosure. I placed a folder on the table, one of the many I'd prepared. This contains photographic evidence, timestamps, and witness statements. You'll see that many of these violations were issued by Mrs. Miller, acting outside her authority as HOA president. Karen shifted in her seat, lips pressed tight. The investigator gestured. Mrs. Miller, do you have a response? Karen stood, adjusting her blazer. These claims are exaggerated. The association has always acted within its rights. The homeowner in question has been difficult, combative, non-compliant. We enforce rules equally across all properties. I didn't say a word. I just handed over another folder, a printed spreadsheet from the HOA's own database, obtained through discovery. According to your records, I said, you issued only 5 total violations to other residents in the last year. 37 were issued to me alone. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face flushed deep red. That's out of context, she snapped. He was constantly. The investigator cut her off. Mrs. Miller, sit down. The silence that followed was heavy. Even her own board members were avoiding her gaze now. The investigator flipped through the documents, then looked up. These records also indicate misappropriation of HOA funds, payments made for maintenance that do not correspond to any invoices. Mrs. Miller, can you explain where these funds went? Karen froze. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her husband shifted uncomfortably in the back. That was when the county officer stood and placed a small stack of photographs on the table. Each one showed a storage unit filled with boxes, yard equipment, and furniture, all purchased with HOA funds. Karen's signature was on every receipt. The room erupted murmurs, whispers, outrage. Even the committee members looked shocked. Karen's voice broke through the noise, high and desperate. This is slander. You have no idea what I've done for this community. I built Maple Hollow. Without me, this place would have fallen apart years ago. But the more she spoke, the worse it got. Her words came out frantic, defensive, unhinged. She pointed at me. He's lying. He's been trying to destroy me. He called the news. He turned everyone against me. I didn't move. I just let her dig her own grave. When she finally ran out of steam, the investigator leaned forward. Mrs. Miller, you're under oath. Are you denying that these purchases were made with association funds? Karen's jaw tightened. I don't recall. Then allow me to refresh your memory, the investigator said, holding up a bank statement. Because the transfer came directly from your personal account after the HOA reimbursement was processed. That's embezzlement. The room went still. Her husband stood abruptly, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out. For the first time, Karen looked small. The rest of the hearing unfolded like slow-motion justice. Neighbors began stepping forward, one after another, sharing their own stories. The couple who'd been fined for their deck. The widow with the blue door. Even a former board member who admitted that Karen had pressured them into voting her way under threat of expulsion. Each testimony stripped away another layer of her authority until there was nothing left but the truth. Maple Hollow had never been about community. It had been about control. When it was over, the investigator cleared her throat. Based on the evidence presented, the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association is hereby suspended pending full audit and restructuring. Effective immediately, Mrs. Miller, you are removed from office. Gasps filled the room again. But this time they weren't in shock. They were in relief. Karen sat motionless, eyes wide, face pale. Her hands trembled on the table. Then, as the investigator gathered her papers, Karen whispered something barely audible. You'll regret this. But her voice didn't carry the same power anymore. It sounded hollow. The crash outside the hall, the sky had turned gray. A storm was rolling in from the hills, wind whistling through the trees. The first real rain in weeks. Neighbors stood in small clusters, talking in low voices. For months, we'd been divided by fear and silence. But now there was something new in the air, unity. I stepped out into the drizzle, feeling the tension slowly lift off my shoulders. For the first time in nearly a year, I didn't feel watched. Then I heard the familiar hum of an electric motor behind me. Karen's golf cart. It screeched to a stop beside the curb. She sat there, soaked, her hair plastered to her face, mascara running in dark streaks. The defiance was gone. Only anger remained. "You think you've won?" she said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand what you've done. You've ruined everything." I looked at her, really looked at her. For all the power she'd held, for all the fear she'd spread, she was just a person who couldn't stand losing control. "Karen," I said quietly, "it was already ruined. You just made sure everyone saw it." She stared at me, lips trembling, then slammed her foot on the pedal and tore down the street. The tires skidded on the wet pavement. Seconds later, there was a sharp crack, the sound of metal against concrete. I turned just in time to see her golf cart veer off the road, straight into the community sign she'd had installed last year. Maple Hollow Estates. A place of order and pride. The sign split in half. Karen stumbled out, unhurt but shaken, staring at the wreckage like she couldn't believe what she'd done. Neighbors rushed over, shouting, helping her up. No one was hurt, but the image of that shattered sign, her perfect symbol of control, lying broken in the mud, it said everything. As I watched the flashing lights of the ambulance fade into the distance, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, disbelief, even pity. The fight had cost me sleep, money, peace, but standing there, I realized something. I'd taken back my life, and even though Karen's reign was over, the echo of her power would linger. A reminder of how easily good people can be silenced by fear, and how one person's obsession with control can destroy an entire community. But for the first time in a long while, Maple Hollow felt quiet again. Real quiet. And as the rain fell over the broken sign and empty streets, I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of person still believes they own peace, once everyone's finally free from their rules? The new Maple Hollow. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Maple Hollow was quieter than it had been in years. The ever-present buzz of Karen's golf cart was gone, replaced by the distant hum of lawnmowers and the sound of wind rustling through the trees. For the first time since moving in, I could drink coffee on my porch without the knot of anxiety in my chest. No fear of surprise inspections, no notices fluttering in the wind, no watchful eyes counting the number of flower pots I kept by the steps. Karen's removal from the HOA board became the talk of the county. The news outlets that had first covered my story released an update titled, "HOA President Suspended After Abuse of Power Investigation." The article spread quickly through homeowner forums and local Facebook groups, sparking hundreds of comments from people who'd lived their own version of this nightmare. It was strange, humbling, even to realize how common these stories were. People wrote to me from across the country, "Our HOAs just like that. I wish I'd fought back like you did. You gave me courage to stand up for my home." For the first time, what had once been a private war started to feel like something bigger, a warning and maybe even a lesson. The county appointed an interim administrator to oversee Maple Hollow until new elections could be held. This time, the process was transparent, open ballots, audited finances, clear communication. No secret meetings, no anonymous fines. When the administrator invited residents to volunteer for the restructured board, I almost laughed. Me, joining the HOA after everything? The thought was absurd. But then I realized, maybe that was the point. I wasn't fighting against community rules. I was fighting against abuse disguised as community. If people like me stayed out of it, it would only leave room for the next Karen to step in and start it all over again. So, with a deep breath and a reluctant smile, I submitted my name. The first community meeting under the new administration felt surreal. The clubhouse that had once felt hostile and suffocating now felt neutral, bright even. Gone were the old banners and Karen's framed President of the Year certificate. In their place hung a new sign. As the administrator introduced me and the other candidates, I scanned the room. Familiar faces. Neighbors I'd avoided eye contact with for months. Nodded, smiled, even clapped. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short. "I'm not here to lead," I said. "I'm here to make sure no one here ever feels powerless again." That was it. Simple, honest. When the votes were counted later that night, I wasn't just elected to the board. I was elected president. Taking over the HOA wasn't easy. The financial records were a mess. Missing receipts, unauthorized withdrawals, accounts that hadn't been reconciled in over a year. But with help from the county and a few trustworthy neighbors, we untangled it. We set new bylaws, established transparent voting systems, and even started a fund to repair the damages Karen had ignored: sidewalks, gutters, community lights. We tore down the broken sign at the entrance and replaced it with a modest stone marker that simply read. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Slowly, the neighborhood began to heal. The young couple who'd been fined for solar panels reinstalled them with HOA approval. The widow with the blue door painted it back to her favorite color, and this time, everyone applauded her for it. The family who'd been hit with outrageous fees for their deck, we reimbursed them in full. It was more than rebuilding property. It was rebuilding trust. As for Karen, she disappeared from Maple Hollow almost overnight. Her house sat empty for months, the once pristine lawn now overgrown. Rumor had it she and her husband moved to another county, somewhere with fewer restrictions. Ironic, given how she'd once clung to them like sacred law. Eventually, a young family bought the place. Kind, quiet people who waved to everyone and hosted a barbecue the first weekend they moved in. No gossip, no politics, no pettiness. Just neighbors being neighbors. The night I saw smoke rising from their grill and heard laughter drifting across the cul-de-sac, I realized something. For the first time since we'd moved in, Maple Hollow finally felt like a community. But it wasn't all easy. Even after winning, I found myself flinching whenever a letter from the HOA appeared in my mailbox. Old habits die hard. For months, I kept my files organized in case the fight ever returned. Then, one morning, I got an envelope from the county clerk's office. My stomach dropped until I opened it. Inside was a formal letter of commendation, acknowledging my role in exposing corruption within the homeowners association system. It wasn't about me personally. It was about accountability, transparency, and reminding people that even small voices can stand up to power. I framed that letter and hung it by my front door, not as a trophy but as a reminder of everything it cost to get there. The story didn't end at Maple Hollow's borders. A few months later, the same journalist who'd covered my case reached out again. She was producing a follow-up documentary on HOA overreach, not just my neighborhood but others across the country. She wanted to include my story as part of a larger narrative about homeowners reclaiming their rights. When she asked me what I'd learned, I thought for a long time before answering. It's not about lawns or fences or mailboxes, I said. It's about people forgetting that power doesn't belong to them. It belongs to everyone they're supposed to represent. The moment you start enforcing control instead of community, you've already lost the meaning of what a neighborhood is. She smiled. That's your closing line. The documentary aired a few months later, and I watched it from my living room, surrounded by the same walls that had once felt like a cage. Seeing my story framed alongside dozens of others, people from Florida, Texas, Arizona, California, I realized just how widespread it all was. Different rules, same fear, but also same courage. A year later, life had settled into a peaceful rhythm again. My mornings were quiet. My kids were thriving. The garden behind the shed, now rebuilt, overflowed with tomatoes and herbs. Sometimes, when I watered the plants, I'd glance at the repaired community sign down the road and smile at how symbolic it all felt. I'd fought a war I never wanted, and somehow I'd won. But it wasn't just my victory. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been bullied into silence, fined into submission, or made to feel like a trespasser in their own home. People started calling me for advice. Other homeowners in other towns, caught in their own HOA nightmares. I wasn't an expert, but I listened. I shared what I'd learned. Document everything. Stand your ground. Don't be afraid to shine light where others prefer shadows. Because the truth is, these stories only stay buried if we let them. Sometimes, late at night, I drive through Maple Hollow with the windows down. The streetlights glowed soft and gold against the trees, and every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something that made me smile. A neighbor repainting their shutters bright red, kids chalking the sidewalks, someone installing a birdhouse in their yard. Things that used to earn fines now earned compliments. That's when it hit me. Community doesn't need rules to survive. It needs empathy. It needs the kind of quiet respect that says, "This is your home, and you belong here." The final line, one rainy evening, almost a year to the day since the hearing. I found myself standing by the new entrance sign, watching the rain streak across the stone. The valley looked peaceful again, washed clean. For a moment I thought about Karen, about how power, when built on fear, always ends up devouring itself. About how easy it is to lose sight of what really matters when you start believing that control equals safety. Then I thought about everyone who'd stayed, everyone who'd rebuilt this place not through force, but through forgiveness. I smiled, not out of victory, but out of gratitude. They say every neighborhood has its ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains, but the kind that linger in memories, whispers, the corner of your mind where the past still echoes. Maple Hollow had plenty of them, but they weren't haunting anymore. They were warning, because in the end, this wasn't just about an HOA or a power-hungry president or a pile of fines. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop letting fear dictate their peace. And as I locked my front door that night, the rain still falling softly outside, I realized something simple but powerful. You can rebuild a house after it's damaged. You can replace a sign after it's broken. But trust, once you take it back, that's something no one can fine you for, no one can revoke, and no one can ever take away again. The valley was mine again. Not because I'd won a fight, but because I'd finally understood what home really means. Home isn't walls or fences or manicured lawns. It's the feeling that you belong, even when someone tries to convince you that you don't. And as the porch light flickered softly behind me, I couldn't help but whisper the words I wished I'd said to Karen long ago. You can own the rules, but you'll never own peace.